Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll just give folks a few more minutes before we get started. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Dan Hogue. I'm the Regional Resource Director for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee with Care and Treatment Programs. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on the topic Mutual Support and Recovery, an Evolving Landscape. Just a reminder, we'll be conducting this session in webinar format, meaning all participant microphones will be muted. We will not be able to see or hear you. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A or chat features to ask any questions. Depending on the volume of questions, if we can't get to your question before the end of the hour, we'll have someone from our team follow up with you directly. Today's presentation is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. We'd like to thank our educational partner, CE Learning Systems, for assisting in providing these credits through co-sponsorship with the American Psychological Association. Please note that in order to receive your credits, you'll need to complete the post-webinar evaluation. A link will be emailed to you directly after the presentation from cego.com. After finishing the evaluation, you'll have immediate access to your certificate of completion. Today, I'm proud to introduce our presenter, Reverend Jack Abel. Reverend Jack is Senior Director of Spiritual Care at Care and Treatment Centers. In this role, he provides oversight for spiritual care services on the Pennsylvania campus, where spiritual counselors and interns offer a mix of individual, psychoeducational, and experiential group services, depending on patient needs and preferences. Reverend Jack is also the principal presider for the historic Karen Chapel service, a gathering of family members, alumni, and current patients for a weekly celebration of recovery. As part of this, Reverend Jack oversees the chapel music program, which invites musician patients to share their creativity with the Karen community as a therapeutic element in their treatment experience. Reverend Jack began working at Karen in 2008 as the Director of Pastoral Services and worked with Father Bill Holtberg to evolve the chapel program and clinical spiritual care services on Karen's Pennsylvania campus until Father Bill's retirement in 2015. Reverend Jack is an ordained and authorized minister of the United Church of Christ. He previously served as an elder and endorsed chaplain in the United Methodist Church. Reverend Jack pursued advanced studies in sacramental theology at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. He holds a Master of Divinity, summa cum laude, from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and also an MBA from Wilmington University in Delaware. A graduate of the Interfaith Studies at the New Seminary in New York, Reverend Jack completed his undergraduate studies in mathematics and music at Hampshire College in Massachusetts. He began his liberal arts studies at the New School for Social Research in New York City. I will now hand the presentation over to Reverend Jack to get us started. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us again today. And thank you for joining us, Reverend Jack.
Dan, thanks so much. I'm smiling as I look at that wild hair picture. Okay. Greetings to everybody who is on the presentation, and I appreciate those who have taken an interest in what I believe is a tremendously important subject. And a couple of introductory comments. I'll apologize for, I'm going to kind of sprint through a lot of material, but it is my understanding that we're going to make available the slides for you afterwards. And so then if there's things that you would like to review, you'll be able to go back and do that. And I like to speak in front of audiences where I have the audience in the room so I can sort of pace myself, but it's very hard for me to do that. And I don't know if I'm being funny or not. So we'll just do our best. This particular slide identifies learning objectives that were necessary to be articulated for the programming to qualify for CEUs. And I'm going to jump over it to my agenda slide because the agenda parallels the learning objectives. So I hope by your spending time with me today that I can help you to understand where mutual support fits in as a component of use disorder care. I hope by spending time with me today, I can help you be perhaps better informed than you already are about alternatives for mutual support that exist today for our use disorder clients. I hope by this time that I can make some commentary and I'll even be bold enough to say recommendations for us in this field of medicine about how we speak about alternatives for our clients in care. And then the last bullet's really two objectives in one. It's to sort of manage why this shift is difficult and some of the controversies that attend to the kind of old school ways of thinking about recovery and new ways of thinking about it. So I've given an overview. That's sort of where we're headed. The slides will move through each of these four objective areas in sequence. I'm going to try and finish up about 10 minutes of. I will say also, we did get some questions in advance of the presentation, and I'm going to incorporate a few of those questions in as we walk our way through. So where does mutual support fit as a component of care for people who have substance use disorder or other related concerns? In order to talk about that, and you might have noticed I use this phrase, recovery-oriented systems of care. I don't know how many of our participants will be familiar with that language, but I'm going to speak to you from a recovery-oriented systems of care perspective throughout today. And in my work here on our Pennsylvania campus, that's an approach I try to adopt and model for not only our clients, but for my colleagues and for the team which I lead. So what is the difference between that and what it has been contrasted with, which is a disease model? I'm not a person who disregards the classification of use disorder as disease. I think that's a supportable claim. But I also think that when we talk to our clients from language that is laden with this disease perspective, it can sort of start the agenda out from a problem perspective rather than a solution orientation. And also, you'll see the three bullets on the left. Like, I think that when people thought about addiction care in the last decades, many providers have been limited in their ways of thinking about how to approach the solution pathways. And sadly, unfortunately, along with that, movies and representations in film have sometimes kind of, and television and media have sometimes thought, oh, you go to treatment and fix the disease. Like, and that's one of those things. If I have cancer and I get it cured, when am I cancer free? That's one of the perils of framing the challenge of this rather than chronic concern and a wellness orientation. So a recovery-oriented system of care model, which is prevalent in many frontiers today, not just in use disorder care, but in mental health, is one that approaches the notion of care from multiple modalities, a network of frameworks and providers, and tries to cast the relationship between the providers and the constituent, the patient or client, in a journey of a longitudinal sort of way. We're gonna work with you together, and we're gonna bring a variety of different tools and techniques, and we're gonna help you experience something that you can look forward to. So it's optimistic, and I think that it's very legitimate to approach people who have been suffering in the quagmire of a use disorder crisis with the hope of a recovery-oriented perspective. So that doesn't yet speak to the mutual support need, but when we approach use disorder care from a ROSC perspective, as clinicians, we are helpful. I'm going to flip back for 1 second. What are the multiple modalities? The multiple modalities that a clinician has, I think, an ethical responsibility to be aware of are the three that are listed here. There are pharmacological aspects of use disorder care, especially with substance use disorder. So this would include things like naltrexone, Vivitrol, Subutex, and certainly withdrawal medications and inpatient treatment, and perhaps a variety of other things. I'm not a pharmacological provider, but I think that medicine can play a role. Peer or mutual support groups, which is the focus of my presentation today, and then more conventional individual and group therapeutic modalities. Common among them would be CBT, newer offerings like ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, a whole host of methodologies, even specific trauma-related protocols. All of these can be, DBT is another one that you sometimes find people wanting to bring alongside certain populations within the addiction movement. These are part of a recovery-oriented framework to consider as a part of the toolkit that may be relevant for any individual client as we address their suffering and hope for long-term healing and good outcomes. Where does mutual support fit in? Where does the second of those three fit in? Here's a slide that cites three different sources. There is a slide at the back of the presentation that provides the exact references for these different and a couple of other sort of reading suggestions. But I don't know how many of you are familiar with the recent publication by Kelly and others regarding Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step facilitation. Really interesting Cochrane survey of other studies that have been done on 12-step work, so a kind of a summary review of the evidence. And I think many people feel sort of definitively resolved a long-standing debate about whether AA works or not. So we exist in a period of time now, post-2020, in which we can tell our clients, yes, Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step facilitation outpaced CBT and motivational interviewing for increasing abstinence, to many people's surprise, and really, really belong in consideration, at least for a component of care. One of the questions we did receive early on was which of the various alternatives work best. I wish I could tell you I have a pie chart and I could show you outcomes. The truth is, at the moment, use disorder research on multiple support alternatives is limited. You can look at these citations and go to the back of the articles and look at their citations, and but no one can say SMART is X% more or less effective than Dharma, and Dharma is X% more or less effective than LifeRing, or that data is not yet available. Will it be? Perhaps. I have a different way of sort of approaching the emerging variety of alternatives, but there is this study in 2018 that did show, in a study of several different alternatives that were identified as leading at the time, that there was not a big significance in difference in efficacy. So it turns out not only does AA and 12-step work quite effectively and importantly, But it turns out from Zemmour and others that that the other alternatives should merit consideration alongside of the 12-step and Alcoholics Anonymous approach. So that's interesting. And one can wonder, like, why? What is it about mutual support that makes this so such an important contribution? So one of the things that, let's just ask if I could speak up, and I'm going to try and hold my mic closer to my voice, which might help also. So one of the things that mutual support does that conventional therapeutic modalities may not do, and pharmacological modalities do not necessarily do, is mutual support is cited with regards to serious mental health patients in the third bullet as enhancing social connectedness, belonging, and providing better coping strategies. I'm making a bit of a jump here because it's a different demographic that is being served, but I think I have a legitimate basis for the argument I'm trying to offer, which is that this is what mutual support brings to the table that the other two modalities in this set of toolkits may not be as strong in relationship to. Certainly group therapy can sometimes do this if it's over a long period of time with a fixed cohort. But in terms of addressing a chronic condition and seeking long-term improvement, social connectedness, belonging, and improved strategies for coping are what we get out of mutual support. So what I'd like to say is that this limited set of citations and also the kind of visible manifestation within our social world of these different movements and the growth of them and the adherence of tons and tons of people within these different mutual support alternatives are testimony to the way in which mutual support figures as extremely important. And I think that any provider who wants to privilege pharmacological and conventional therapeutic interventions and underplay mutual support is doing their clients a disservice. That's an opinion, I realize, but I'm trying to support it with evidence. So that's one of the reasons why in the organization which I serve and hopefully in the field as we work, I believe we have an ethical responsibility to understand the alternatives that are emerging on the landscape. And as practitioners of care, know how to listen to our clients, just like medical and pharmacological providers listen to clients and help to try to determine which of a variety of pharmacological options might be best for the client. Or in a conventional therapeutic interaction, which modality might be the best is EMDR or CPT or DBT for this particular client. We want to make recommendations that are wise, sound, and appropriately tailored to the people that we're working with. So as a result, I'm going to walk us through a set of slides that identify features, potential benefits, and common criticisms of the different sort of sets of alternatives that are out there. And a disclaimer first, that when I say potential benefits, I just mean that there are things that people say about the movement, and common criticisms, again, there are things that people have said about the movement. I don't mean that the criticisms are essentially and inherently valid or that the benefits adhere. I'm just trying to help take a look at what's out there. So that's a good thing to say. I think I made the point earlier. I recognize that you may wish for a firm recommendation of what's best. My particular perspective is that your relationship with your clients should be used to determine what's best. Any such survey should begin with Alcoholics Anonymous. all of the slides in the next series here have the same structure, features, benefits, criticisms. And the, I'm going to call the color burgundy, which is funny as an alcoholic, but I am a person in long-term recovery. The burgundy bullet points are there for your and my interest because I think they're important highlights for each of the different options. AA deserves some credit as the progenitor of the genre, the urtext of the set of support alternatives that are out there. And if you were going to med school to learn about non-steroidals, you would learn about aspirin, or about SSRIs, you would learn about Prozac, even though not every patient would be prescribed aspirin, nor would every patient be prescribed Prozac. But I believe that it's very legitimate for institutions of use disorder care to educate constituents about this particular movement, understanding the ways it sometimes is a challenge for people because of its historic positioning as a first in really human history of being an effective solution for such a large constituency. 1935 is a long time ago. There's a big library. Another reason why often people can be very enthusiastic about this particular expression of a recovery support option is it's tremendously accessible around the world in different languages. And especially now as COVID turns to endemic, COVID brought an increase in AA's presence in the online context. So it's, while many people say AA doesn't evolve, at least in that way, AA's accessibility evolved in the last couple of years. Why do people ricochet off of AA and 12 steps? Well, the concerns on the right, I think, I'll just sort of cite them quickly. People identify AA as overly religious or spiritual. People find the language patristic and parochial. People, there are people within the AA community who can present as if their solution is uniquely or specifically, singularly better or right. Those three, I think, all fall into a group. Many of these mutual support groups face the same concern that is now in this fourth bullet, which is that they're there's no oversight, there's no defrocking, there's no ethical board to lodge a complaint because a meeting leader committed some sort of an inappropriate, made an inappropriate statement to a new member or preyed upon a vulnerable person. And that's just a risk in mutual support environments in many cases. There's one notable exception within the repertoire here, but that's a criticism that people level against the 12-step movement. And some people have also said that its emphasis on ego deflation, which you can cite within some of the literature, is not necessarily helpful for certain populations. There have been, especially some womanist voices within and in response to AA who have argued for self-empowerment and more motivational and encouraging emphasis. What I would like to say, perhaps somewhat defensively, about the things that have been said about AA and the 12 steps, and this will get to a point I'll make at the end of the presentation, I hope, if I have time, is that many of these criticisms here and the ones that are to follow merit deeper study and investigation because these movements are nuanced, complex, and have lots of aspects. So for example, there are many, many people who do not find the 12-step thing overly religious or spiritual in focus and yet identify as atheist or agnostic. There are many people who will say that their capacity to read Shakespeare or other antiquated literature and find meaning and value from it helps them in approaching the 1935 language of the historic Alcoholics Anonymous literature. And there are many people who also bracket the our way or the highway kind of voices within the 12-step world and allow themselves to find a home within the 12-step communities while perhaps, exploring related alternatives. So all of these things might merit deeper investigation. And I think it's important to just acknowledge the Kelly study again. It does show that this material can be tremendously effective. Let me move a little faster. That was important for me to spend some time on that slide. We have several more to survey the landscape and then some important points to get to. You have different 12-step programs that I like to refer to them as the A fellowships. So if one of these things is referred to by an acronym and ends in an A, it's likely that it's modeled after the AA 12-step model. Narcotics Anonymous, Crystal Meth Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, and many, many more. And the outsider might wonder why you would have so many of these different variants. And I'll just speak to a couple of reasons in my experience why I think they've emerged and will persist. One is that I think, going back to the reason why mutual support is important, is that a sense of belonging is important. That when you narrow specifically to a more clearly identified substance relationship or behavioral issue, you can enhance the sense of fit and belonging, a really deeper sense of commonality. If you were doing crystal meth and I was doing crystal meth, we have a greater common base of experience. And coping and solution sets may line up also in parallel better. But another point from a clinical standpoint, which relates to my experience, when I first began having the privilege of working as a clinician in use disorder care, I was a person in recovery myself, and I kind of thought, well, I know about recovery, so if my next client has a gambling issue or my next person has a relationship issue, but it's an addictive relationship or a food disorder issue, I can just apply my experience, strength, and hope to their concern in a fairly direct manner. Well, first of all, there's an obvious challenge with regards to some of those because the kind of understanding of abstinence and healing differs with food and relationship interactions and other forms of process, as they call them, addictions versus substances. But also at like some deeper qualitative level, I just have to say I've come to be very deeply persuaded that as a care provider, I have a responsibility to really become deeply aware of how culture and substance and experience shape the use disorder spiral down and path forward and up and out of recovery. So healing in each of these areas and sickness in each of these areas is really quite different. So it's been a humility challenge for me to not presume that I know, because I know one, I know all. And that's what I also think. I think that it's very legitimate for us to at least make our clients aware that there may be very specific communities in which they will have greater fit and belonging, and where the approach to recovery is better tailored to the particular way in which their use disorder has expressed itself. Okay. SMART's one of these things I think really bears more talking about, and it's I think it's awesome, and I think it's, as many of these things are terribly misunderstood unless people do the work to get to know them. So there's the acronym: Self-Management and Recovery Training. It identifies, first of all, it's more of a self-empowerment modality. Also, it has an educational sort of cant. It was founded in 1994, so it doesn't go back to 1935, but it has a nice long history. And in order to establish itself, against now an already well-established 12-step movement. They went online very, very early. So now that COVID has forced many of the other movements that are more grassroots to join them in the online context, they're not singularly kind of the leaders in the online continuum, but they kind of were for a while. They had, I think, some of the most robust online options. The other bullets I won't go all into, but it's their model is structured around evidence-based tools that I think are borrowed more from what I have been labeling as conventional individual and group therapeutic modalities. So CBT, motivational interviewing, are among the, and REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, are among the toolkits that they bring to the interventions. And SMART meetings are structured very differently than 12-step meetings. They have a very different feel. And one of the things that's very different about them is, I think, unique among the set, is that they do have trained facilitators. You can't legitimately host a SMART meeting unless you've gone through a formal training program. And it's a good program. It's not terribly expensive. I highly recommend it for people who are interested. It's a great way to learn about the material. And SMART does a lot of things differently than the programs I've already spoken about. So they do encourage people when they speak to identify with their name, but not with any kind of label. You don't say I'm an alcoholic or an addict. And there is no emphasis on spirituality per se. I know many people in SMART are very spiritual and religious in their disposition, and it becomes for them a component of how they support themselves, but it's not a structured component of the, let's say, curriculum. SMART sometimes confuses people as to whether it's an abstinence or moderation program, and I just would want the clinicians out here to know it's an abstinence program. It's not confused about it at all, but I think some people out there, and some of our clients are like, oh, I want to do SMART, thinking that it will encourage them to drink successfully or whatever. But it's not that. And a person who attends SMART will quickly come to understand that it's encouraging people towards successful and sustained abstinence. It just approaches people who struggle with return to use and without the word relapse. So I'm just going to disregard the other two critical bullets because I don't know that they're really fair. So that's SMART recovery. Here's another one that is worth knowing about and being supportive of for the right client. And I call it one. It's two. It's still two. Recovery Dharma and Refuge Recovery. There are the two acronyms. Started as Refuge Recovery in 2014, and there was a schism in 2019, and now you have Recovery Dharma and Refuge continues. Both Recovery Dharma and Refuge draw upon Buddhist principles and practices as the foundation for the way their constituents sustain abstinence and recovery. If you want to know the history of the schism, you can look into it. A big difference between Refuge and Recovery Dharma is that Recovery Dharma, the post-schism new birth, has a very strong peer-led emphasis. And that's related, sadly, to history of conflicts with the first founder of Refuge Recovery, which I want to express no particular detailed opinion upon. So I think from my experience and testimony, what I will say is that I've spent some time in and around these materials. I think they're wonderful. It's my personal opinion, they can be a sufficient alternative for two reasons. One, because of their newness, but also because of the kind of cultural way in which the Buddhist mindset approaches the task and the constituency that first brought this to the table. There's not as much research around either of these two offerings, and may not come to be as much research. So if you want to be able to point to numerical analysis in order to base your recommendations, I would punt back to the evidence that seems to show that various different alternatives work. And there's a growing body of people who love Recovery Dharma and the predecessor and continuing Refuge. So it's beautiful, cool stuff. And one of the things that you could argue is really great about it is that it puts mindfulness, which is, of course, very important in contemporary mental health care from a conventional individual and group standpoint, front and center. Mindfulness practices are incorporated right in the meetings. It's non-theistic, also, people like that. And it emphasizes empowerment and responsibility. So it's worth knowing about, as I said. And all of these can be found online very readily, and you can learn more about them. One I didn't know much about until doing my homework for this presentation. I've, of course, always heard about it, but was intrigued to find out it started in 1973 as Women for Sobriety. It's cited in one of the studies that I cite, and my cisgender male status would not have needed to sort of explore Women for Sobriety. But as a clinician, I do think that we have this ethical responsibility to learn about what's out there. So the Women for Sobriety movement it has a particular founder who was a constituent of a spiritual movement called Unity or New Thought, which is something I do know something about from my own training. And Unity and New Thought's very interesting. It's an approach to spirituality that's grounded in positivity. And so that's great in a recovery-oriented systems of care mindset. But it's interesting also, ironically, it becomes the basis for some people's criticism of Women for Sobriety, which is, like if you see in the lower right corner of the slide, some people have said that the 13 affirmations of the New Life program of WFS, in being so gosh darn positive, ask women to deny the hardship of their suffering and experience. So I'm not sure that's true, but anyway, it's just important to know there's a gender-specific, positively oriented, spiritually based program that's been out for such a long time. I don't think you hear so much about it. I don't know what the size of their membership is, but I think it could be potentially of great help for certain members of our client populations. Life Rings, another one I only really recently have come to know more about. 1999, West Coast beginnings. My just opinion and qualitative impression was pretty cool. So 3-point philosophy: sobriety, secularity, and self-direction. What seems very much to be the quality of thought around this movement is what I would use a word, bespoke. In other words, that the individual authors their own sort of approach to their recovery in response to their being a part of the community and the shared dialogue that people have. So it's less a program and more people who author programs and work then together to sustain and support one another in sobriety, secularity, and self-direction. So Life Rings Secular Recovery is out there. It does have online options. I think this is one of those where if you really want an in-person opportunity, there may be limited places in which it's available. But, I haven't said this aloud, I'll say it on this one. I think several of the bullets have said that self-direction and self-empowerment and self-efficacy are trigger words among some constituents of the sort of 12-step historic mutual support communities, because the thinking is basically, if I could have helped myself out of this, I would have, and I need to rely on something other than myself. But I think that can be a oversimplification and unfair. So that's why I haven't stressed any of these criticisms, because some of them are superficial and tangential and not necessarily ones that would be real barriers to entry for people who like the other aspects of the offering. Before I dive into the slide, I do want to say that we did get some questions before the webinar even began about faith communities and how faith communities' roles participate and what to do if I'm a faith community person and I want to build a recovery sort of component. And that last question, I would say, is a separate question. It's not the agenda of this particular webinar, but there's tons of resources out there, and both Celebrate Recovery, which is cited here, and the NACR, the National Association of Christian Recovery, I think is what the acronym is, could be a place to go look for that person. Or if not a Christian community, if Jewish or whatever, there may be constituencies within your faith community, or you could learn from some other faith tradition about how to apply it to your own. But what about faith communities? It's a great question. And I'm a ordained minister. I'm an atheist turned chaplain. I realize that's tongue in cheek and sounds a lot. There's a big story behind it, but it's the truth. And of course, at one level, I'm enthusiastic about the middle first burgundy bullet. I think that when a faith community is able to offer a recovery support context that allows the individual to incorporate their faith preferences in a direct way, that is something, to borrow the word, that we can celebrate. I think it's it can be very, very worthwhile. And the most notable and widespread of these certainly would be the Celebrate Recovery movement, which came out of a particular set of non-denominational Christian communities in the 1990s. And on the left, you see one of the things that Celebrate says is it's open to all hurts, habits, and hangups. And it takes both the 12 steps and 8 Christian principles to structure what is, I think, legitimately called a curriculum. And different communities that have Celebrate Recovery gatherings have them at different times and different frequencies and hold their observances in different ways. If your client is drawn in this direction, my personal opinion is I never discourage enthusiasm. What I will say is I also have had clients who have returned to care and expressed that the invitation to all hurts, habits, and hang-ups meant that they were in what was constituted as mutual support communities, where the mutual support was more around theology than around suffering. And that there can be a value to, it goes back to when we talked about the difference between A and the other A fellowships, to a very strong sense of shared suffering. So I think this is one of the challenges that faith communities have in offering use disorder context for support, is how to straddle that that variety and meet the specific needs of the individual. Although if you think about LifeRing, like LifeRing allows a bespoke aspect. So I don't think there are any simple ways to sort of either incorporate or disregard any of the landscape of options. And indeed, the spirit of this presentation is to ask you to become aware of what's out there and have a non-anxious response to the variety of offerings and seek to understand their diversity and become open to and adapt to making recommendations that are suited to your client rather than the ones that we prefer ourselves. Couldn't go without mentioning moderation management. Still very much in existence, has had a somewhat bumpy history. It was founded in 1994 using what I mean, harm reduction is such an important term, and really uh, how can any of us be against reducing harm? So, but I also think harm reduction is used in very specific ways in use disorder environments that are tremendously important. And moderation management, I believe, has a place on the landscape of these alternatives. But like each of them merits a good look. Moderation management emerged and still continues as a program for people who are not sure whether or not they should stop and are seeking to use a mutual support context to experiment with and enhance moderation. My lower right hand bullet, I think, is where I land, which is I think moderation management is the kind of thing I would be supportive to the clients that we have in residential treatment who shouldn't even be in residential treatment. I think if you have a use disorder care that a clinician can diagnose as moderate or severe, then moderation management is a misfit in terms of modality and acuity of illness. But for people who are in terms of their motivational enhancement, not yet ready to address a use disorder concern, moderation management could be an option. And one of the truths that is often misunderstood about use disorder, about substance use, is that there are a very, very large number of people who can moderate their substance use, who can have an incident or a problem or a crisis and dial it back, and then successfully be moderate users in the future. And there are just tons and tons of people who kind of get a little out of control and then pull the reins in and don't need the other alternatives. And moderation management could be helpful for such a person. So I think that ends my quick survey, and I'm going to look at how much time I have left. I have very little time. Let me just say, I will include these slides in here for you. I want to point to two slides. You've heard me use use disorder instead of addiction more than that, mutual support instead of the program, journey instead of disease, recurrence instead of relapse. And one of my favorite terms is refractory illness. The idea that sometimes when people have had multiple treatments and are continuing to still struggle, we should at least be open to criticizing the treatment rather than the client. And the word refractory comes, I was described once as a refractory cancer patient, and that meant not that I was failing, but that the treatment that had been provided to me was not working. And there is so much personal responsibility in adherence to treatment recommendations that can be a piece of it. But we can move in a direction as a field to be more invitational, more curious, more encouraging, more supportive of our clients. That was one really important point for me. And the other slides, I think, are self-explanatory. I apologize for running out of time. But the last thing I desperately wanted to say while I have an opportunity to have the soapbox is, should we send clients to 10 programs at once, or 5 or 3? I believe that I've taken this from language from Patrick Carnes, one of the really important teachers in this field of care, especially around sex and sex-related disorders, is this thinking that recovery is like learning an instrument or a language or becoming a doctor or a welder or whatever, that apprenticeship and deep immersion in the methods and materials and trial and error and the acquisition of a complex set of sort of skills and techniques which are not easily codified and committed to YouTube videos. Like, it's hard to move out of use disorder misery and into flourishing and resilience and recovery. People do it, but there is wisdom in choosing one of the support modalities and learning it well, rather than trying 2, 3, or 4 at a time. My point is, if you wanted to learn a new language and you never learn a foreign language, you wouldn't start learning French, English, and Spanish in the same week. And I won't repeat it. So this idea of it puts a responsibility on us as clinicians to make more skillful recommendations. And especially early in care, I think there's a good argument to be made for allowing our clients to be aware that there are a variety of alternatives. But as we champion them on their way, I think it can be really helpful to let them be steered towards something which is evoked by your encounter with them. And here I have this Gandalf Yoda image. I love this particular image. They are about to embark upon a journey which will have tremendous challenge, has a kind of a heroic and epic quality. And we do them a great service, I think, by helping them understand that it may indeed be very, very challenging. One of the things I really like that I get to do on a very regular basis is congratulate, affirm, and celebrate people who are returning to treatment. And when I have somebody who comes in here and they're at their 7th treatment or whatever, I applaud them for their tenacity and persistence. And I think often I get a wry look and a perplexed response, because there's so much shame that often attaches to return to care. But I deeply believe it's fair to say we should be celebrating people who are staying in the effort to improve their lives and find a way out of the misery of a use disorder life. One last thing to say, and then I'll turn it back over to those colleagues that were helping me. I did not really address what has been called so much lately diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a tremendously important piece of the puzzle here in terms of what facility and context you may be serving in as a clinician, and also what's accessible and what recommendations might be most wise for our clients. And I think that the field of use disorder care has work to do to be successful in supporting the entire human community, which universally is subject to this affliction. So I'm going to retire my presentation. I'll just show you that. So I hope that you've heard me say mutual support merits increased emphasis, not less. I think that even though pharmacology is important and there are great clinical methods out there, absolutely, but we have good evidence to say that doesn't mean we should be discouraging meeting attendance or belonging. And somebody asked how many meetings or whatever. Well, I don't think you have a right number, but less is a bad idea. We as clinicians are responsible for knowing what's out there, and there's a turn that comes along with that towards enthusiasm and motivation, and away from this more dire and a negativistic sort of model. So thanks very much. I'm going to stop my share, or I guess I'll leave the share up. If we need more slides, I'll walk us through them. And I really appreciated being with each of you.
Thank you, Reverend Jack.
And thank you so much, Reverend Jack, for the informative presentation. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. There were a couple of questions that came through, Reverend Jack, while you were talking. And the first one was, are we seeing an increase in the number of clients seeking other support, the 12-step recovery?
Huh. That's a good question, because my guess is they've always been here, but yeah, I think so. I think that there is an increased openness both within the like what we bring to the table as practitioners and what our clients are asking for may be mirroring itself. But I would say yes, I think so.
And the next one I have is, with the pandemic creating more need for online mutual support groups, how do you feel about online support versus in-person support?
I appreciate the question. I was surprised. If you get the slides and look at one of the citations on the slide, there's actually a recent study about online versus in person in the context of the pandemic. So people have jumped right on it. And if I read the outcomes correctly, what they were saying is that it's sort of the opposite of what I would have guessed, is that early on, there was a increase in effectiveness outcomes and adherence through the availability of online access. Longer term, 12 months and past, not so much difference. But interestingly, like having online stuff available may help people with onboarding. As a long time 12-stepper, I lamented the migration to Zoom and feared it would hurt new enrollment. But that might not be true.
Okay, very good. And one last question, then we'll start to wrap it up. Somebody has asked if they are able to email you email questions directly to you.
I don't mind that at all. My email is revjack, REVJACK, @cairn.org. You can see the spelling of the organization on the slide.
Fantastic. Very good. Well, thank you again, Reverend Jack. And as a reminder, this presentation is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. Please watch your email for a link from cego.com to complete your evaluation. Karen, we have an exciting in-person event in the works. Please join us on Wednesday, April 6th for a webinar entitled Trauma-Informed Oriented Care, TIROC, a Foundation for Wellbeing and Recovery. It's been approved for 1 CEU credit and will run from 12 o'clock till 1 o'clock. On Thursday, April 21st, Karen will be also hosting an in-person event entitled ASAM Fundamentals of Addiction. It's eligible for 8 CEU credits and will be held on Karen's campus in Wardersville, Pennsylvania. The cost is $189. There, of course, will be many more webinars scheduled in May and June. Please visit us at cairn.org/webinars for more information and to register. Please watch your email for more details. In the meantime, please reach out to your local regional resource director at any time for additional information, resources in your area, or any other questions regarding admission to any of our programs. And again, I'd like to thank Reverend Jack for his time today for a very meaningful presentation. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.
See you, everybody.